Let the record show Mr. Ziegler is bribing the advocate. We all do it. Business going down in Lexington. It is the appointed hour of 7 o'clock. Welcome all to the September 2nd, 2021 edition of the Lexington City Council. And I'd like to call the meeting to order. And first item of business is if you will stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all very much. And thank you all for observing the school-wide use of masks for our meeting this evening. I do invite you, if you want to speak, for clarity, if you're comfortable lowering your mask to speak, and remind you the meeting is recorded, so folks that are listening will be able to hear, so please make use of your microphones. Next item is consideration of the agenda. I'm not aware of any corrections. There is an addition of a closed session. And City Manager, the purpose for that closed meeting
is to discuss property considerations. There we go, microphone. To discuss property considerations with our attorney.
Very good. Unless there's an objection, we will have the agenda approved with that addition. And I hear no objections. Next, we'll move into presentations, and I will invite Eric Wilson to come up to provide us a minute in history. Welcome.
Hi there. Red is a go in this instance, right? Get that straight. Good evening. Good to see you all again. This History Minute, it won't be a biography, a little spicy bit of undiscovered history. What I'd like to do or flag what I'd think of as 2 points, 2 moments to look ahead to, and also first ask us to consider how we choose to define historical periods or historical eras. Those 2 moments, the first centers around the 250th anniversaries of the American Revolution and of Lexington's founding. That'll be coming up in a few years, starting in 2026 and running on until we decide those anniversaries have run done. And the second has to do with the civil rights era in Lexington and beyond in the mid-20th century and beyond. So to start, the English teacher in me meets the historian to ask, how do we effectively use periods? Like historians and teachers, textbooks and media, communities spend due and good attentions considering who and what define our local and global histories. But tonight, let's focus a little thought on when we mark in time those histories, how we identify eras and patterns, not just people and places and things. History departments call this periodization. Big, fancy, abstract noun. In more everyday terms, we might simply consider where patterns of experience begin and they end and inevitably overlap. Thinking about periods prompts us to bracket not just single moments in time, but stretches of time. Those connected units hold some things together and they separate other experiences, just like periods do in clarifying our progressions of thought in sentences. This is inevitable and important for many good reasons. We can't run our brains through all of history's many moments, and we can't do so with equal measure or attention. Otherwise, we get lost in the noise of too many dots in the timeline, too many people to sort and fuse and confuse. But when we consider the different positions we all hold in our lives, contributors to different institutions and organizations, as family and cultural descendants, and you, as community leaders, enjoy the opportunity and responsibility as planners, no less, to think of these ahead. Washington Lee's motto is to not unmindful of the future. I think the geology department nailed this when they said they're not unmindful of the past. And I'm amazed the geology department beat the history department to that. It was brilliant. So those are the broad questions I'd like you to think about when planning opportunities come around, when we think about what kinds of ceremonies, what kinds of speakers, what kinds of symbols, what kinds of activities a city might represent itself in now, looking back and going forward. So quickly, just to this 250th anniversary, you will start hearing the word sesquicentennial. You might hear the word semi-quincentennial, or if somebody's really trying to go for the gold, they will say bicenquinquagenary. The brassiest actually is quarter millennial. You know, if somebody is saying this is not the 250th, but we're just getting started on that. That's one way to look. Our town is founded at that revolutionary moment and chose a name to signal that. When we come to those moments, do we and others first and foremost look at American history as one 250-year stretch, as two eras, up to and then after the Civil War, many smaller chunks that more fully define people and principles in between. This is not a sermon or directive that it must be one way. I think it's an inviting opportunity to consider in what situations we might do that. The second prompt came from an invitation to speak tomorrow to Professor Michael Hill's pre-orientation program about Freedom Riders. It was something that Ted Delaney started. He asked me to talk about Lexington in the Civil Rights era. I was very eager to do so, but instantly said, well, when does that start? What is it? Which civil rights era? Is it the long civil rights era, stretching back into the 19th century? Are we talking about different voting rights? These, again, are questions that history courses reckon with, but in terms of how we tell our local histories, when we have only limited time and space available to do them, who do we put in there? How dense, how broad do we want those timelines to be? I've said before some things I really liked about it's the 2040 comprehensive plan. Am I getting that right? The one that was just approved. The way that timeline was reworked, the narrative themes went in there. Those are good places to really think mindfully about which figures and how we'd like to do them. So, lots of opportunities and work ahead. These will happen in our schools and community events. So thank you for your leadership, your curiosity, the questions you all share interpersonally and institutionally. I look forward to continue these periods ahead.
Thank you, Eric. Wouldn't dare try and repeat some of the things you said referencing a corner millennial, but look forward to.
I'll send those to you, Frank.
Thank you. Look forward to celebrations. Look forward to celebrations, and I know that council, with every decision they make, they look at the foundation that we stand upon and where we go from here, so mindful of the future as well. Again, thank you for your insights and sharing history with us. Next item is consideration of minutes. You had in your packet the August 5 meeting minutes. Unless there were any corrections or changes council would like to see to those, we'll approve those as presented. Next item is citizens' remarks and comments. Is there anyone who would like to speak to council this evening? Hearing none, we will dispense of that and go into our consent agenda. Those items were also detailed in the agenda documents, and I would ask for council's consideration.
I make a motion we approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Roll call vote. Mr. Ayers?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Ziegler?
Aye.
Mr. Alligood?
Aye.
Ms. Strawn?
Aye.
Ms. Alexander?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much, and make note of the fun things going on in downtown Lexington. Next is unfinished business. First item is consideration of a cigarette tax. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. This is not a new item. Obviously, we've been through this and covered this ground several times over. I just would make a few remarks. One is that we did hold our public hearing on this item in our first meeting in June. There was only one public comment at that time, and that was from the Wholesalers Association asking us not to put a tax on cigarettes. I also spoke with our Commissioner of Revenue, Ms. Karen Roundy, and she said that she is very well prepared to put this in place should council adopt it on January 1st, 2020. She and her staff have already done some of the background work. She's coordinated with both the Rockbridge County Commissioner of Revenue and talked to her peers in other communities, so she's ready to go. I would also note that, again, my recommendation to you is that should this tax be approved, that we consider very strongly allocating these funds for recreational facilities and parks improvements. Just as an example, with the recent adoption of the Jordan's Point Park Comprehensive Plan, staff and I have begun grouping some projects together that could be done in the immediate future in a logical sequence. We put together just a grouping of three groupings of projects, and those smaller projects have combined to create expenditures of $80,000 to $120,000 for each of those three segments. And those are very small project segments, I have to add. So is there need? Yes, there's a need for that type of revenue, those resources for our parks and recreational facilities. And I would, as in the past, strongly encourage City Council to approve this tax and this ordinance for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. For the city manager's recommendation, I would ask for council's consideration. For, if nothing else, for the purpose of discussion.
I'll move to approve ordinance to amend Lexington City Code, Chapter 366, taxation, to add a new Article 9, cigarette tax, to impose a cigarette tax at the rate of .0125 dollars per cigarette, with a minimum of 25 cents per package in the city.
Second?
Have a motion and a second. Discussion. Ms. Strawn,
I hadn't even touched the button yet.
I can see it in your eyes.
Yeah. I guess the one concern I have is I am fine if we decide to use those funds for parks. I don't want to make that policy or any future commitment. I'm just, in general, I don't like that idea of setting a tax for a specific use, but I don't think it's right for us to hold any future council to that. If you want to budget that way, I will probably support that in the future, but that part of it I'd like to leave out.
Any council members want to respond to Leslie's request to eliminate the requirement that this tax exclusively be used for improvements and maintenance of city parks and recreational facilities?
Well, I think that was the recommendation, and we're just approving the ordinance. And so we can certainly take up recommendations by the city manager later during a normal budgeting process. So I understand completely what Leslie is saying, and we've done that to a degree before, where we've raised the property tax rate by a couple pennies, and we've said this is dedicated to such and such. After a year or two, it's no longer dedicated to that type of thing. And so there's definitely a rationale for Leslie's point. But tonight, I'm going to support the motion that was made, and I know that's what we're dealing with.
Thank you. Mr. Alligood.
Thank you. I'd like to throw on the table consideration of this money possibly being used to address our catalyst projects that have been approved and not funded. To have these catalyst projects now that have been approved by City Council and the Planning Commission as part of the comprehensive plan, this is a good opportunity to add funding these. It's not a lot of money for those and whatnot, but I want it on the table for consideration.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Smith.
I'll just rely on the guidance of the city manager to allocate these revenues as needed. And it appears right now that I'll just rely on what he thinks is the best use of these funds.
Any further discussion from council? If not, we have a motion and a second, and we ask for a roll call vote. Mr. Ayers.
Aye.
Mr. Smith.
Aye.
Ms. Strawn.
Aye.
Mr. Ziegler.
Aye.
Mr. Alligood.
Aye.
Ms. Alexander.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you all very much. And I think City Manager has direction on council's feelings.
Yes, sir.
Next item on the agenda is review of the street renaming policy. I'll call the City Manager for introduction.
Well, again, we're all very familiar with this policy, and there's really no movement on my part to recommend any changes for you this evening. As instructed, though, when this policy was approved by City Council, I wanted to bring it back before you so that you could review it at this meeting. We did go through, council approved, staff implemented the change of New Market Place to Evergreen Place. From a staff perspective, we did learn some of the mechanics of what we were required to do to make that change. It is a relatively simple process. There is some time consumed by city staff in processing the address changes through the post office and other agencies. Those are internal costs. In this particular case, of course, we had only one resident on that street, one address that needed to be changed. We also only had 2 street signs, so time and effort and expenditures were pretty minimal. Streets with more names, more signage would require more time, more cost, still within the realm of what we can do if council decides that that is the direction you want to move in, or if the public wants to move in that direction. So I don't have any recommendations for you this evening. The $400 fee that was put in place, I would still say is viable to pay for the expenses that are appropriate or necessary to make these changes, just like any other change, whether it's a rezoning or a site plan change. The individuals advocating that charge or that change pay for that activity. So I think it's an appropriate charge still, and that's the only other piece of information I'd share with you this evening.
Thank you, Jim. Members of council, questions, comments? Mr. Smith?
Refresh my memory, what is the actual cost of a new street sign?
I'm afraid I can't tell you what that item is exactly. I doubt if it's $30 to $40 at most.
Curious.
It's almost more expensive than the old sign sold by Main Street Lexington for $40. But Mr. Ayers?
Yeah, I was just going to say about the $400. I totally understand, Jim, what you're saying about that, that fee being needed to recompense the city for expenses. But it's not like we're being inundated with requests. And I would like to make clear, I'm happy with leaving the $400 fee in the policy as it stands. But my own personal feeling is if somebody came to us next year with a valid request to change a street name and 70% of the people on that street agreed, I would likely want to waive that fee. So, I mean, I'm fine with leaving it in, but just to be clear, I want people to understand that if it's a valid request, we will certainly consider waiving the fee.
That's completely at council's discretion, so I agree and understand that completely.
Mr. Ziegler?
No, I'm in agreement with what Dennis said. I mean, we're here to serve the citizens, but also some of the duties that City Hall performs do cost money, and we do charge for certain services, and so it's fair to have a fee in the ordinance. The current policy calls for 75% of property owners on a street. And so, for example, you might have a street like Confederate Circle, which that would take 9 out of 11, I believe. And so I'm not sure if 75% is the correct percentage. And I just used that one street as an example because that's one street with a name that's was made in the 1950s or 60s and is really out of place within the city. Some folks might be able to make a case for some other streets that have ties to, for example, to the Confederacy, but that particular street is an outlier. And, I look forward to either the residents or council addressing that street name. And of course, it would be much better if the residents did it. But I would ask council to reconsider the 75% threshold.
Yeah, I totally agree, and for some reason, I thought the threshold was 70%. We had certainly at one point discussed that. So I would be in favor of dropping it down to 70%, if my colleagues were so inclined.
Ms. Strong?
I said from the beginning, I'd be satisfied with more than 50%, and so anywhere in that range I'm fine with.
Any other comments?
I still prefer the 75%.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Alligood?
I support what Dennis and David have said about the percentages and about the council prerogative of waiving the fee should there be a valid request. It just seems like it could be considered the right thing to do at the right time, and that would be something for us to consider. In terms of what the percentage is for people on the street, I understand Mr. Smith's thinking for the 75, and I appreciate Ms. Strong's anything greater than 50. I would tend to side with anything greater than 50 in there. I think it'll be difficult to get 100% for sure on some streets, and all you need is one holdout in there. But there are some key street names here in town that are still generating conversation, and council probably will be faced at one time with it. Currently, it's my thought that the $400 fee as it stands would discourage changing street names. And I would prefer to go the side where we encourage valid street name changes, not just a name change for the sake of a name change, but a valid one. So I support Mr. Ayers and Mr. Ziegler's statements there.
Thank you, Mr. Alligood. Anyone else? Ms. Alexander?
I'm inclined to see it still be 75%. There could end up being some streets that have a lot more people than 11 households that perhaps that if it becomes a controversial conversation, you might wish to have that 75% left there so that you have a good feel for a good majority would want to see a change, or you know that 75% don't want the change. So I'd rather keep it like it is.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander. Mr. Alligood?
And just saying now, in my neighborhood, the street that'll be at issue is Confederate Circle. And on Confederate Circle, I want to say, I haven't counted them, but I'm guessing it's about 12. About 12 in there. So 75 is 9, 75% means 9 people on there. And so that means 3 people could say no, and the other 9 could say yes, and it would go. And so, but then 4 people could say no, and it kills it.
Correct.
And there's still a majority on there. So it's, you know, for small numbers, there's an issue. For large numbers, it's less of an issue. So I support Ms. Alexander's statement for the large number streets in there. For the small number streets, I think we need more flexibility. That's my thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Alligood. Mr. Ayers?
Well, I don't think that we can set a policy that differs by the size of the streets, unfortunately. So we're going to have to pick one number. I understand what Marilyn's concern about, you know, with a large street, if you say 50% or whatever, then there clearly could be many, many people on a street who are upset about this change. But I do think that I do think that 70% is moving in the right direction. Like, I would not want to go down to 51% here, but I do think that 70% might be a good sort of middle ground on this, and we can see how that goes. I don't want to drop it dramatically, but I think 70%, and if I were to move to re-adopt this or continue with this, I would make a motion to move it to 70%.
Our purpose this evening is to review it, give council an opportunity to, we've had our first experience with Evergreen Place, and I would encourage council to talk amongst themselves to come up with a plan to move forward if there is consensus to move to 70 or some other number, or adjust the policy. Let me know. We can bring it back before for council's consideration. But I appreciate the healthy explanation and respectful acceptance of everyone's position on this matter. Mr. Smith.
If I recall correctly, I thought we'd passed this policy just to do exactly what you just said, Dennis, was to see how it goes. And we haven't gotten to that see how it goes part with a 75% rule yet.
I think that's the problem, Chuck. I'm not sure that we ever will see how it goes at 75%. So my feeling is to slowly drop this to see where, I think we may need to drop this number slightly to move forward on one or two streets in the city.
Well, as of yet, I haven't heard any proposals or considerations of street name changes put forward to this body or City Hall with an argument that says we're at 70%, can we change the policy and it'll go forward? So I'd rather be reacting to a proposal instead of modifying the policy that we just passed to speculate on proposals or considerations.
Ms. Strong.
Can I make a proposal as far as moving forward? Because I do think it was wonderful that Mr. Knox was our first test case, but one person, as Jim notes, the city manager notes in his report, isn't a true test. And I'd like to try a larger test, and I think Confederate Circle is a good street to look at because it has 11 or 12 residents. It's a medium-sized street. We'll get a better indication. And if council is interested in that, those residents have not brought forward a proposal, but I'd be willing, if with council's blessing, to go door to door and get input from those neighbors and see if they would be willing to partner with us on moving forward. And I assume we would forgive or the fee for that. But I don't want to act on my own if council's in favor of that, so we can further test this policy and get an idea, is 75% good, or just how it works overall. The feedback, and I guess this is an important part that, from what I'm hearing, and Dennis, you're probably a better source, is that Mr. Knox hasn't really had any problems with the name change.
Yeah, I spoke to Mr. Knox yesterday, and he said things have gone relatively smoothly. He's getting mail now at Evergreen Place. We're still waiting on Google Maps and Apple Maps to show Evergreen Place, but from his perspective, things have gone fine. So he has not been upset with the process. Yeah.
And I would like to take Ms. Strong up on her offer and vote for the door-to-door and offer to accompany her.
Beat me to the punch, Charles. And I guess we can't all three of us go because we'd have to have Doug
Well,
along.
we could advertise and all of council could invade Confederate Circle and solicit the neighbors. I do feel compelled to call on our attorney for any guidance or things that we may not be thinking about with this initiative.
None that come to mind other than a sort of the general reminder that this, what we're talking about is internal sort of city policy, staff policy. So it's not necessarily, it's not like a resolution or an ordinance that council's voting affirmatively to approve. It's sort of more giving Jim and his staff personally and the city manager as an institution sort of guidance on how council would like to see this carried forward. So this was really just an effort to sort of put some structure to this process, but ultimately, if, as I've said sort of throughout, council has the authority to change the name of any street in the city by resolution at any time. So anyone, you all could, on your own motion, move for a resolution to change the name tonight, and legally, there's really nothing anyone can do about it. So, you know, to the extent we're getting to distinctions between 75 and 70%, I think it's highly likely, sort of in Chuck's example, if someone does get to 70%, I think it would be well within the city manager's discretion to say, well, we're at 70%, we're not quite to 75, but we're going to go ahead and pitch it to council and see what they, how they respond. So I think we're moving in the right direction, sort of one case, one issue at a time, and tweaking and refining as we get there. But ultimately, from a legal perspective, this can be and might be a very simple process that council can take up on their own initiative at any time.
Thank you, Jared. And I appreciate the reminder that this just made a process, so if citizens had the desire to see their street name changed, it gave them a process to orderly do that. And council meets the first and third Thursdays of every month, and glad to hear from the public at any time. So if there are folks that do want to make that step. Dennis?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the reason why we adopted this policy was to assure our citizens that there would be an orderly process to this and we would not move by fiat. And my concern is by taking the lead in this process, even though I personally would love to see Confederate Circle's name change, that we're kind of muddying the waters, and it would lead other streets to the concern that, oh, well, city council could, by fiat, do that on our street. So I do feel like we need to internally adhere to the policy that we have chosen. So I would love it, Leslie, and I totally support you in doing that, but I feel like we need somebody on Confederate Circle to kind of lead the charge. So anyway, that's my point. I think it should be, as Mr. Knox has done, I think we need a point person who is on that street to kind of lead the charge.
And I can talk to a couple residents, I think we all know a couple residents on that street, and see if anyone's interested in taking the lead. And Charles, you may even know more people on that street than I do. But I have to agree with the comments Mr. Sigler made at the beginning, and also with what you just said, that I'm not in favor of council going through and renaming a bunch of streets, but that is a street it is time to change that name, and it's by no fault of the current residents, and there may not have been any real intention with the name of the street, but that is one I think is difficult. So I'm hoping that we can partner with the citizens and with the residents of that street, and that they will take the lead. But I think there's some, we'll need to have some conversations with them to put them at ease that from what we're seeing so far, this is a manageable process, and we want to be here to support you with it, because this will be a little bit different just because it's more people. We'd rather see you, the residents, pick a new name for that street. So I'm trying not to step on toes too much, but I think we kind of need to at least initiate that conversation. But you're right, I think we should also try to encourage someone on that street to then take the lead with it.
The disdain that you speak of with the street name and the need for it to be changed, it will be interesting to see how the residents feel about the name, because they may not, as a majority, want the street name changed. But applaud the efforts and again, the discussion. Relative to this particular policy, my expectation is there are no changes to be made tonight, but again, conversation amongst council. If you do want to make a change, you can raise that issue and just alert me if we want to modify percentages or, but keep the conversation going. It's always healthy to speak with your peers and figure out a better method and process. So, Mr. Ziegler, I don't want to cut things. You're good? Okay. Any other comments relative to the policy?
Just
Ms.
had-
Alexander.
Yes, I received a phone call from someone who no longer lives here but owns property on a street, and she wants to consider this for a street, and she already has a name considered for that street. And I suggested to her that she wait until we go through the process of changing one street with more citizens to comment back, just to see how it goes, and so that we get feedback about the cost or any stumbling blocks that people have. So I'm sure she'll be coming to us eventually to request.
Very good. Yes, I anticipate there will be further inquiries and requests in the future, to be sure.
And this has nothing to do with history or whatever. It just has to do with wanting to name a street by a family member.
Very good. Now, that's the origin of this policy and discussion really has to do with the Confederacy and issues related to potential white supremacy and hatred and things of that nature, and looking at more equity. But sometimes it can be as simple as just wanting a change. Sure. So thank you for pointing that out. Any other discussion? Hearing none, call on the city manager for an update on the Spotswood development projects.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor. Again, an issue we're well familiar with, and there's very little change. Actually, I did want to note that, again, the city attorney and I have been in contact with the folks from RARA. They're very anxious to close, wanted to see the survey so their attorney could look at it. The next step in that process is Planning Commission will consider the subdivision of that original parcel at their next meeting next Thursday night, and then that will come before you on the 16th, 2 weeks from tonight, for review as well. At that time, I believe then our city attorney will take that for title review and the necessary legal aspects of that subdivision and plat recording that needs to occur. The second thing I would note is that I have some weeks back contacted all of the parties who indicated initially or subsequent to our discussions and hearings back in January that they had an interest in the parcel to further define some of the questions that had come up and clarify for those parties. A few responded to me and said, thanks for the information, that's helpful. At that time, which again is a week and a half perhaps ago, several parties noted they still had very active interest, and some seemed a bit lukewarm or weren't sure they would follow through, but thanked me as well and you that they would be considered should they wish to send in a proposal or be involved in the process. So that's the update I have on both the sale to the RARA folks and the potential development of that remainder of that parcel. Any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Mr. Alligator.
The infield water tower project wasn't mentioned there, but it's been on the table in there, and what's the status on that?
Separate item, of course, but you are correct. I did receive notice, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I did receive notice from the interested party that they have finished their due diligence on that site, and with the change in the economy we've seen over the last several years, that project that he had proposed and considered is no longer feasible from his standpoint, his point of view, so he's withdrawing from that. So there's no, at this time, no project on that site.
So the property is available for anyone else that would care to make an offer to purchase?
That would be for council's consideration, but I would, if it came to me, I would accept an offer.
So just to be dotting an I here, crossing a T, Mr. Gaskins has 100% totally withdrawn any of his interest in that infield water tower property.
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
Jared, can you speak to where we are in that process? Has he given notification, refunds? He walked away, we collected a check, or?
I believe he's walked away. We've collected the check. I think it was the 5,000. So we've collected the check. That's sort of taken care of. And yet now the city owns it. And again, if anyone wants to make an offer, they're free to do so, just as they are with any other city property. But it's no longer considered tied up in that agreement that we had with Echelon Resources.
Thank you, sir. This is obviously a different topic than what was advertised in the agenda. I don't know that we want to take up infield property at this point, but council can be thinking about what direction we go from here that we may want to give the city manager regarding that property. Any other questions? Mr. Alligood.
Another dot on the I. I would be interested in the city advertising that property and asking for bids and process to develop that property that could be reviewed by, say, the planning commission and whatnot as a way to move that ahead to benefit the city.
I'll lean on staff to correct me, but I'm not sure it's the planning commission's responsibility to vet offers on property or RFPs.
Not offers in my mind, but proposals on what the property might be useful to do.
Again, I'm not sure that's under the purview of the planning commission, but certainly noted your opinion and perception with that property.
And the reason I mention it is because one of the suggestions that Mr. Gaskins had offered as part of his plan was to subdivide the property along infield with 4 driveways.
Correct.
Coming to infield. And I'm thinking, maybe there could have been a cluster development somehow in there. It just seemed to not be a good way to develop that property, but that was what the proposal was.
Right.
And certainly nothing's built on it, so nothing was cast in stone on that. But I would just like to see a little more innovation and use of city property that gets turned over into taxable property.
Yeah. Would tend to agree with you, but the process does not include the planning commission. They don't have a level of expertise on staff or on the commission for development. Their responsibility, and I'll get Ms. Strawn to chime in case I get out of bounds here. Their expertise is looking at the proposals that are brought forward, not bringing forward proposals for developers to consider. And that the local government doesn't, we don't have staff or individuals to put together a development plan. We've got a good track record of unsuccessful efforts,
Yeah, I was
I
going
would
to
suggest.
agree with you that we have a good track record for not being successful in that, whatnot. And so maybe the planning commission, I misspoke when I said the planning commission, but certainly there could be a discussion, a conversation prior in requests for bids for property, for proposals that outsiders would want to make. And this is what they would do that I guess city council would then evaluate or the city staff would evaluate, not the planning commission.
Correct.
So I take the planning commission off the table on that. But again, just looking for some innovation, not 4 driveways.
Absolutely, absolutely. The next item on the agenda are reports on boards and commissions, the Blue Ridge Resource Authority. Mr. Smith.
Short report. Massive excavation on cell 2 was supposed to happen this week, but the rains delayed that till next week. And as you know, when you look in the activities report on our desk in front of us, Ray York, our director, his official last day was Monday the 31st. And we are currently searching for a new director. We have hired a new administrative assistant. So that position that was vacant is now filled, and that's where we're at. Any questions?
If you want to know, Ray's retirement lunch was barbecue served by JJ's Meat Shack in Buena Vista. I would encourage members of council, if you have the opportunity and in that neck of the woods, to stop by and visit. The mound of grass is inviting and a great view of our community. And I asked the city manager to work with Fred Dudley in the potential for sometime in October, perhaps, for us to take a field trip to visit the Blue Ridge Resource Authority site. I'm not sure everybody on council's been out there, but it's always good to visit the places that we're participating in financially, and just be on the lookout for that invitation. Mr. Alligood.
Mr. Smith and I did visit that site on a particular day during my orientation visit, and one of the impressions, the main impression that I got, it's a large site, but it's a spectacular visual site, spectacular. And, I'm thinking down the road that, once we use the property for what it was intended, that it can be reclaimed for other uses and whatnot. And I'm thinking this is just a beautiful vista that's out there. It's nothing like what exists in most places. And if we could somehow, and the county as well, take advantage of that, I think it would draw people. Now, the fact that it's a landfill begs the question, but things can be repurposed and reclaimed.
Well, that'll be in about 50 years, hopefully.
Right, and I'm not sure I'll be here, but there'll be others who could benefit from it. And it's kind of that old story, you don't plant a tree for today, you plant it for the next generation and two.
Yes, certainly the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago.
Yes.
The second best time is today. So, thank you, Mr. Alligood.
Exactly.
Main Street Lexington, Ms. Strawn.
Main Street met on Tuesday, August 10th, and we approved the 22 budget. The Economic Vitality Committee is beginning the downtown property survey. This is an update of the property owner survey that was conducted about 5 years ago. We will include questions regarding the prevalence of fire suppression systems in downtown buildings, and based on those results, Main Street will consider organizing a seminar and/or providing resources to upgrade buildings. That's a question that's come up quite a bit recently, is what are the needs, what's the cost, and how can the city and Main Street participate in making those improvements. The Gateway Triangle Garden, the fundraising is beginning, and the Gateway Triangle, is right at the north entrance. The renderings that Arthur Bartenstein put together are beautiful, and so you will see those shortly and hear more about it and about the fundraising efforts. And the sidewalk sale begins tomorrow and runs through Sunday. And the Get Downtown event with the W&L first years is coming up. About 425 new students are expected. And Washington Lee is having commencement 2020 on Saturday, September 11th. And that's all I have unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Strawn. Any questions? Planning Commission.
The Planning Commission met on Thursday, August 12th and 26th. We didn't take August off like council did. And Jamie Gooden was elected chair, and Blake Schuster was elected vice chair. And Nick Betts was welcomed to the commission. And over the past two meetings, we had several items of business. We unanimously approved 3 items. One was an entrance corridor certificate of appropriateness application by Matthew Yeager to replace the signage for BB&T T, which is now Truist Bank, at 537 East Nelson Street. The second was an application by Russ Orison for a site plan review for construction of the Center for Excellence on the Sigma Nu Educational Foundation property located at 9 North Lewis Street. And the third was an entrance corridor certificate of appropriateness application by John Adamson for exterior improvements to the property at 539 East Nelson Street. And a COA will be coming shortly for the signage of that property. The Planning Commission also continued to work on the small cell wireless facilities zoning ordinance. And that's all I have unless there's any questions.
I wouldn't say a question, but a request perhaps that as we look at additional cellular towers, that we go back to what I perceive to be our policy of putting in not antennas per se, but what appear to be either a chimney or a pergola or something, as opposed to the what we have on top of the Gin Hotel. So,
Yeah, and that's really under ARB, the Architectural Review Board, their purview. But yeah, so they will have to do similar design guidelines for these small cell facilities and probably either reevaluate or beef up what they have for the macro, I think those are called macro facilities.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Shaw on Planning Commission?
When is the comp plan, I guess, re-review coming up?
Well, we're planning on annually, around the time when we start our CIP, because we're trying to connect it to the capital improvement plan budgeting. So it'll start around December, January.
Mr. Smith, I'd say, relatively speaking, I agreed with John Driscoll that we would look at January and July as planned meetings to hold jointly with the Planning Commission for that purpose. And the January to talk about CIP and budget and things that could happen, and then in July for implementation planning with city staff. So that's quasi on the books. Told the Planning Commission welcome anytime to meet if they have a question or have issues that they need greater clarification from council. But we have our liaison in the interim, but would expect January and July to be the 2 times a year that we meet with the Planning Commission jointly to talk about such things. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. Regional Tourism Board, Mr. Ayers.
Board won't meet again until Wednesday, September 15th, but I did want to mention a couple things. First, the 50th Annual Buena Vista Labor Day Festival is next Monday. The parade kicks off at 9:30 at Perry McClure Middle School and travels to Glenmore Park Pavilion for political speeches by local and statewide candidates starting at 11 a.m. The Rockbridge Beer and Wine Festival is at Lime Kiln Saturday and Sunday, September 11th and 12th from 12 to 5 each day. And a unlimited tasting ticket is $30 in advance or $40 at the gate. And if you're a teetotaler, it's only $15. There will be live music on 2 festival stages all afternoon. I wanted to mention that Regional Tourism's 2 websites, LexingtonVirginia.com and RockbridgeOutdoors.com, combined saw 46,000 user sessions in July. Roughly 80% of those visits were new visitors and 20% returning. And in that same month, there were 15,000 click-throughs to partner businesses. And those are local hospitality businesses that have links on the site. So that's a really good pass-through and supporting our local businesses. And finally, you might have noticed Southern Living September edition has a nice travel write-up of Lexington and Rockbridge. Leslie was kind enough to forward that. I found out that the George's PR firm actually brought that particular article's writer to town, and Regional Tourism provided editorial support and collateral materials for that visit. And that's it.
Any questions for Dennis? The 50th Labor Day celebration was supposed to be last year, and because of COVID, it was postponed to this year. So, very cool. Encourage folks to take that in if you've never been. It's a treat, a rare treat of sorts, and the political speeches are definitely made for television. So encourage you to go check it out if your schedule allows. Raro, Mr. Ziegler.
The RARA Board of Directors met last night for a little over 2 hours. It was the first meeting that Mr. Coffey, Chad Coffey, our new executive director, ran. We received Chad's, just a rundown on a lot of his initial impressions and some of his initial ideas, and it should be very exciting as Chad gets more of a feel for the whole area and the things that we're going to be able to accomplish. Some of his activities in his first few weeks have included meeting with the two city managers and the county administrator. I believe he's either already met with each mayor of the two cities, meeting with chairman of the Board of Supervisors. He also plans to be meeting with the superintendents of the 3 school districts, and he continues to be open to meet with anyone that wants to meet with him. Because he, again, wants to get a good feel for the whole area and where RARO can move forward. As it is the fall, that means that we're dealing with soccer and football and cheerleading, and all those sports are kicking off a little bit, no pun intended. Right now we're using, I believe, 12 facilities throughout the city, Buena Vista, and the county. And so we are trying to go and use facilities where the kids are in their communities, and making use of all the fields that the county and the two cities provide. Obviously, RARO is nothing without its volunteer coaches, and that's the same this fall, as a lot of our coaches have come back to assist, and a lot of the coaches play a huge role in recruiting their athletes to come out. And my 8-year-old is playing soccer because of a great volunteer coach in the city. Thought that my daughter would make a good run at playing soccer, and so my daughter was at practice tonight. And then I would just, while I don't want to ever attempt to list all of our amazing volunteers, I will just share that we really appreciate someone stepping forward. Mallory Douglas is really helping with cheerleading, and so that was something that we always look for qualified coaches and instructors in cheerleading, and we have a lot of them, and Ms. Douglas is helping us this fall, and we're excited about that. And I understand that Sage may be an assistant coach a little bit. So thank you to Marilyn and her family. But I'm open to any questions, and I can guarantee you that Mr. Coffey, Chad Coffey, our executive director, would be open to any questions from any council members, and he's certainly open to any questions from any residents of Lexington, Buena Vista, or Rockbridge County.
Thanks, Mr. Ziegler. Any questions for David? I would just pile on by saying I had the opportunity to meet Chad, and a dynamic guy. He is a pickleball fan, and it'll be exciting to see how he incorporates that in the offerings from RARO. And just wanted to ask you to take back to your board thanks and congratulations for a terrific process and an ultimate hire. One of our own that grew up in the RARO system through Buena Vista and Perry McClure. So it wasn't without a lot of work and consternation, I'm sure, but congratulations on a job well done. Threshold, Ms. Alexander.
Threshold met on Wednesday, the 25th at 4 p.m. It's a new schedule, meeting on the 4th Wednesdays instead of the 3rd Tuesdays. However, we still did not have a quorum, but we did have discussion, and that's as far as we could go, not having a quorum. And we talked about the fact that we would need to have on our next agenda discussion of our mission, our past accomplishments, and what the future looks like for Threshold. We also discussed topics that will be decided by Planning Commission over the next year, and we will probably be giving input on that in regard to cottage houses, granny flats, accessory dwellings, pocket neighborhoods, tiny houses, the wireless facilities. Also, the topic of affordable housing came up and the different interpretations of what affordable housing means, as well as how to dispel some of the negative stereotypes of that terminology. The READY grant does have one component about housing, and they're considering a housing study to include our 3 jurisdictions. The guest speaker that we've talked about previously, who would work in conjunction with Threshold and Planning, has been in contact with us since his vacation, and he's working on a presentation to include talking about housing costs and rent overburden. That term means that the rents today are not necessarily affordable, having the standard formula for affordable housing at 30% of their income goes toward rent. However, in many instances, the rent amounts can require much more than 30% of the household income. John Driscoll with Planning Commission, who initiated this idea about this seminar series, will be meeting with us very soon to discuss the housing chapter of the comp plan, the strategies to address housing issues and possible solutions, as well as determine the possible dates to consider having such seminars with Planning Commission. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander. Mr. Alligan.
Thank you for a nice report. Affordable housing, it's a big question, and it's a huge question. And I want to just remark what was in the news a couple months ago in Charlottesville, where UVA, University of Virginia, announced that they would give university land for the purpose of developing affordable housing. And their project, what little I've read about it, mentioned somewhere in the neighborhood of the creation of 1,500 affordable housing units over years, over 10 years or so like that. The thing that got my attention was UVA was known to be a large landowner, and I'm wondering if maybe we have some of that same university landowning situations locally with the two universities, and maybe there would be a project down the road to consider affordable housing where a similar gift might occur. And I would like to think we could have a discussion involving that very question about that. And affordable housing is an important area for this town and for the residents who live here.
Thank you, Mr. Alligan. Any other questions for Ms. Alexander? Hearing none. Mr. Alligan, Maury Service Authority.
Thank you. The Maury Service Authority had its monthly meeting on Tuesday this week, and in that meeting, the city's request, Lexington City's request for subsidy from the MSA was approved to the extent that we are now going to receive, the city from the MSA, $254,000 for the express purpose of reducing our infiltration and infusion rates in the city. And so we have, the city currently has a project underway that will benefit greatly from having this extra money. It just means we can do more yardage or footage and get more done. And so this money was freed up by MSA. It's been tied up for some time, but on the request of the city and a new MSA member to discuss that, we are now going to benefit to, again, the tune of $254,000. Now, part two, not about the 254, there's still a good bit of discussion at MSA about the proposed modernization of the MSA facilities. And to that end, on October 12th, 5 o'clock in the County Administration Building will be another work session. It'll be the second and last work session for discussing the needed improvements on the water plant itself. And then after that meeting ends, there will be scheduled later 2 more meetings that will address the modernization questions and finances cost for the wastewater treatment plant. And currently, we stand for the suggestions for improving, the cost to improve the potable water plant. We're at $20 million so far. And it's still under discussion, it's not pinned down, there are no projects exactly specified, but that's the level we're talking about just for that one plant. And so beginning to be discussed is what is it going to cost to replace the whole plant rather than piece it together. And because the plant is definitely aged. And so we're discussing that. So come to the October 12th meeting if you want to hear more about it.
Thank you, Mr. Alligood. Ms. Strong?
I had a question. Last meeting, you mentioned that there was concern about the generator switch station, which sounded like a pretty immediate issue. Was there anything new on that, or?
It's still under discussion, and it's the wastewater Mr. Smith had asked, and I was unable to answer. It's the wastewater generator, and that is still a problem. The discussion now is to basically scrap the control system for it because too many things have been pieced together over time that don't work well with each other. And one of the recent issues that the Director Jordan Combs had mentioned was that the transfer switch, which transfers from the power company to the generator and back and forth when one goes out, the other is supposed to kick in, wouldn't work. And that's the only backup for it. So it was not needed for the thing, but they're trying to get it to work. And the conclusion at this point is that we're looking at a project to replace the entire control system for that generator system. It's going to be pricey, like over $100,000. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Strong, for that question, and Mr. Alligood for having the intel on that. For my report, I have just a couple of items to share with you. Number one, appreciation to Public Works. If you traveled on South Main Street, they've painted the sharrows, reminding everyone to share the road with bicycles. We don't have extensively wide streets to put in dedicated bike lanes, but encourage people to get their exercise and share the road with cyclists. For those paying attention to sports, VMI opens up this weekend against Davidson, which will have the return of Scott Abel and Rockbridge County standout Porter Abel on the sidelines for Davidson, which should prove to be a good game. And the last of some substance, there was some discussion the city manager and I had earlier today about meeting in person and masking. We have a request from the school board to meet virtually instead of in person out of concerns for the Delta variant and everyone's health and safety. And unless there's an objection, what I would love to do is ask the city attorney to come back and have on the agenda for our consideration re-entering emergency status to give us the flexibility if we should choose to meet either hybrid or virtually. I don't, you may remember last year we weren't sure where things were going with COVID, and all at once it kind of all hell broke loose. I think, personally, I'm not a doctor, I have no idea, but the information I've read, I think Delta in a month's time will be behind us. But unless council objects, I'd love to have council direct the city manager and city attorney to work to bring forward at our next meeting in September the resolution to have the state of emergency, to have the flexibility to meet by Zoom if council would choose to do so. Dennis.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask, are the independent commissions, are they sort of dependent on our adopting this? Because regardless of whether we meet remotely, I do know that tourism where we meet is a tiny room, and I think we are going to move to electronic meeting, at least for the next couple months. So can we do that regardless of what? No, we have to, we're dependent on, so we really need to do this then. Yeah,
Give all of
I
us
want
the
to do it.
flexibility. Ms. Strong?
I like the idea of having the flexibility in case we need to do an emergency change. So is the school board asking this in case, or are they planning on going virtual even though
Miss-
the students are in person? I don't get it.
Go ahead.
The superintendent of schools did ask and say their preference was to have a virtual meeting when we met jointly on October 7th.
Does that answer your question? You look perplexed.
Yeah, so when they meet with council, they
When
would
we
like
have
it
our
to-
joint meeting with the school
Okay.
board, Rebecca had contacted the city manager and said, we'd like for that meeting to be by Zoom and not in person.
I like the idea of having the plan in place just in case.
Right,
I mean, if the kids are going to school with masks on, we can wear our masks.
certainly,
I would like to meet in person if our schools are in person.
certainly.
With masks, masks are fine. Any other
Well-
6 feet apart's fine.
I think one of the initial concerns was having enough microphones and what have you. And again, with discussion with the city manager, our work session can be recorded but doesn't have to be microphoned. People can come and attend, but between this room or we can spill over into the gym for social distancing if necessary. It would be just I believe 5 school board members and all of us. So the work session is intended to be a conversation, and I think we can accomplish that in person, and that's certainly the objective. But it brought the awareness, as Dennis has mentioned, and to just have the flexibility in case we want to, a month from now, it may be businesses are shut down, Delta variant's rampant, and the vaccination isn't working. And we may all want to just call in from nowhere, from our bunker. So we have that flexibility, but the first priority and objective is to meet in person when at all possible. So I'll take that as no objections from council and ask the city manager and city attorney to work on that effort. City manager.
Thank you, Mr. Forgot that microphone again. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're all painfully aware, I bet, that Columbia Gas is still working on the east side of town, primarily on East Nelson Street. You may have noticed I've had some calls that some of those areas are pretty rough there, and staff has contacted Columbia Gas to improve the temporary patches. Of course, all those areas where they worked will be permanently patched and repaved once the work is finished, but there are some pretty rough stretches there around the Kroger store and the CVS that I've asked staff to get with Columbia Gas and make some temporary improvements because they're not, some smaller vehicles could probably lose a front tire in one of those ruts, I would guess. Little update on our transit situation. The Maury Express continues to see, is operated by Radar, continues to see improvement in ridership. In August, it was up 439 riders from 2020, which is a 48% increase. They will also begin Saturday service this coming Saturday, and that will also improve ridership, of course. The one deterrence is that with the Delta variant out there, they've been instructed to only allow or the use of 50% of the capacity of the vehicles. So they won't be able to fill the bus up, if you will. And that will probably be in place, from what I understand, until the first of the year, unless it's lifted sooner. In the abundance of caution, obviously. They also, I would add, have a problem finding drivers, and sometimes it has in the past and may in the future limit the number of trips they can make. So we'll hope that they find drivers to continue their service. Just a few updates from the fire department. This past week, they assisted the Buena Vista department because there were explosive levels of natural gas in a home in Buena Vista. And luckily that was vented and controlled, so there was no incident, but a touchy situation there. To the state of affairs in the economy due to COVID, the department ordered an emergency air compressor that would fill up our self-contained breathing apparatus last January, and we finally received that. That 26-year-old piece of equipment failed at the end of last year, you may remember, but it took 8 months to replace it. Members of the department completed their helicopter rescue and safety training exercises in the event that they have to respond to a crash, or in the event that they're using a helicopter to transport people out of an injury or a crash site. On the 25th, 26th, and 27th of August, the department hosted several groups of students from the Maury River Middle School to orient them to the duties of firefighting and emergency services, and Chief Dickerson noted that you cannot start recruiting too soon. Another aspect of the economic climate we find ourselves in is that supplies for projects are severely limited. We found out from one of our biggest suppliers today that Hurricane Ida put another punch to us and to our contractors. 41% of the PVC pipe that we use for sewer line replacement is produced in Louisiana. And so they've noted that there will be other shortages of that material. And of course, that directly impacts our Providence Hill and Diamond Hill projects. And we do expect delays. We haven't heard from our contractors what that means for them, but there's going to be more shortages of that pipe. Activities from the police department. The chief and Officer Dreeland met with W&L staff to discuss possible cooperative and collaborative projects between the department and the W&L students, and they're very excited and interested in some of the projects that could stem from those conversations, so we'll see how that develops, but it was just an initiative by the chief to reach out to W&L and see if there were resources there from students who are interested in working with the community, so that will evolve over time. The department, of course, provided support for the community festival this last Saturday. They had to remove some vehicles that would not, where the owners did not get them out of those sites. They obviously redirected traffic throughout the period of the festival, and they also were there on bike and on foot doing patrols throughout the festival period. And of course, if you were out there, there were some hot conditions midday that day, but good attendance of the festival. We have the speed control trailer employed throughout the city as needed, and at this recent time it's been in South Main and Thornhill Road, primarily because there were some complaints in those areas about traffic going too fast. So one tool that we have available to us. The department also assisted the local schools practicing lockdown drills at both the middle school and elementary school. Officers evaluated the hallways, classrooms, and open spaces to provide recommendations for increasing safety of students and staff during emergency scenarios. Chief Green met with the chief of the VMI Police Department and the commandant to discuss coordinating active shooter drills and to speak with the cadets about high ethical standards and preventing negative encounters with law enforcement. Recently, I haven't seen it in the paper myself, but I know from a number of sources that catalytic converter thefts in the area have occurred. 3 happened right outside our Public Works yard the last week, and they were removed from our RATS vehicles that were parked outside of the yard. I also understand that 20 were stolen from a business just north of town here recently. So I don't know if we as individuals need to safeguard our vehicles, but certainly where there are quantities of commercial or fleet vehicles, they probably ought to take precautions from what I understand. I would also note another unfortunate note is that we had some activities at skate park recently where there were disturbances of some teens bullying other individuals, kids that were there at the skate park, and the police is watching that area. We also had $130 stolen from the outdoor pool during a break-in this past weekend. So we've seen a few activities in the community where the police have to be active and vigilant. We all know that the water line broke on Lee Avenue last week, 2 separate occasions, and of course Public Works responded to that, temporarily fixed those breaks, but after that they also went out and worked until late in the morning to change those 6 customers on that old water line to the new 12-inch line so that would not be repeated again, and then they abandoned that line between Nelson Street and Preston Street. That of course was programmed for work in the Diamond Hill project that's going to commence in 2 years, but obviously the conditions there would not allow that to wait 2 years, and Public Works did take care of that in at least that stretch of water line will not be a problem in the future. Again, speaking of COVID, I would note that unfortunately our regional jail had its first COVID cases of the pandemic. They had 8 cases within the last 2 weeks, and they are in lockdown situation to protect both the inmates and the staff. And the jail has been very vigilant in the past to be sure that COVID did not enter the jail, but in this particular case, as virulent as the D variant is, apparently somehow it got into the jail. There were some cases in the jail. From the planning department, the Sigma new site plan was approved. I think we all were watching that, aware of it and as it progressed, but they did make that approval recently. And I guess I would also second the comments from the mayor and from Councilmember Ziegler that meeting with the new railroad director, he's obviously energetic, willing to work together collaboratively, brings a lot of ideas and energy. Met with myself this week and look forward to meeting with him and working with him in the future. Great selection by that board. And that's all I have, unless anybody has questions.
Any questions for the city manager? Ms. Strawn? Oh, no. Had that look in your eye again. Thank you, Jim. City attorney?
I have no report tonight, but I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Any questions?
Any questions, legal or otherwise?
Dangerous, dangerous. Hearing none, we'll move into new business. There's a request to approve transfer of the Waddell Street right-of-way. Jared, do you want to speak to that, or Jim?
It's just a little bit of house cleaning with the transfer of the VDOT property out on Waddell. The rights-of-way on Waddell Street, when it was originally constructed, were condemned from 3 private folks and some from the town of Lexington to VDOT. So now we're just petitioning the commissioner to return these rights-of-way back to the city. So once the VDOT parcel, the substantive part of the parcel, is returned to the city, we'll bundle everything up together. So when we decide to dispose of the property, all of that will be taken care of in one package, as opposed to one parcel and a couple easements and all that kind of stuff. So basically just a little bit of housekeeping between us and VDOT to make sure the title is clear as to who actually owns these easements and rights of way.
Thank you, Jared. Any questions from council? If not, would ask for your consideration of this transfer request.
I make a motion that we approve the resolution to complete the right-of-way transfer. The resolution is 2021-08.
A second.
Second.
I have a motion and a dueling second that goes to Mr. Alligood. Any further discussion? If not, roll call vote. Ms. Strawn?
Aye.
Mr. Ziegler?
Aye.
Mr. Alligood?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Ayers?
Aye.
Ms. Alexander?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you for your good work on that. It never ceases to amaze me, the boundary lines and issues with property that we have in our fair city. Glad to have this one cleared up. Next item is closed session, and as Ms. Alexander prepares to read us into closed session, I will affirm with the city manager and city attorney, we don't expect any action after this closed session. It's for information purposes for council. We'll probably take time after we're read in to tear down the workspace so that we can meet and Janie can depart. So, Mr. Alexander, if you'll read us into closed session.
Move to go to a closed session in accordance with section 2.2-3711, subsection A, paragraph 3 of the Code of Virginia. A closed session for the purpose of discussing the disposition of real estate, for the property consideration, for disposition of, discussing public property consideration. I've made the motion. Is there a second?
I second it.
Need a roll call vote. Ms. Strawn,
Aye.
Mr. Ayers,
Aye.
Mr. Sigler,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Mr. Alligood. I vote aye. We move into closed session. It is 8:25 PM.
Yes, sir. Doug, if you'll step up to the mic so listeners can hear.
Before you all throw me and everybody else out, don't you all have to be a little more specific than just disposal of property? I believe the Freedom of Information Act requires a little more than that. But I'm not a lawyer. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug.
Let me clarify that, because I was reading from another document, and it had said disposition of property, but this is property consideration.
That's even bigger. And I don't know of anything in the Freedom of Information Act that says property considerations. Is there?
Be potential acquisition.
So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, potential acquisition of property.
Thank you for raising the issue, and thank you, Jared, for providing the clarification. I can assure you that our ambition is to be as transparent as possible, but if you're looking to purchase something, you lose your negotiation opportunity when it's all out in the public.
I'll give you $3.
That will buy entertainment for a month. Again, before we go into closed session, let's tear down the microphones and systems. And we do not anticipate any action after this closed session. We will come back and open, so anybody wants to hang around.